This is the Homemade Modern DIY Kitchen series, where we will show you how we built an entire kitchen from scratch. This episode will focus on how we made these concrete countertops. I picked out a faucet and sink before I started making the countertops. I selected a simple faucet that would only require a single hole through the countertop. I chose a sink with relatively square corners so that it'd be easier to make the knockout in the countertop mold. I'm going to cast the countertops face down in melamine molds in 3 separate pieces. I'm going to start by ripping down some melamine on my table saw to strips that are 2 3/4 of an inch wide. I then cut the pieces to length on my chop saw. I screwed scrap blocks of wood to the strips of melamine that I ripped down. I then screwed these fences to the melamine base. I'm going to cast 2 pieces of countertop in this one mold, so I have to put in a center divider. I used a hot glue gun to secure the corners and edges of the mold. The mold for the middle piece of countertop is the most complicated because I have to make a hole for the sink. I used L brackets to make a frame that's the same size as the inside of the sink. I used my hot glue gun to reinforce the corners and to secure this inner frame to the melamine base. I'm going to use PVC pipe to make the knockout hole for the faucet. I'm going to make a cut down the length of the PVC pipe so that it's easier to remove from the concrete. But first I'm going to secure it to my workstation. I used a piece of paint stirring stick to keep the PVC pipe from closing, and then wrapped it with painter's tape before hot gluing it to the melamine base. I used silicone caulk to seal the ends of the melamine strips for the inner mold, and to seal all the edges and corners. I cut pieces of steel mesh to use as reinforcement. I'm going to use Quikrete 5000 for these countertops and mix it in a mixing tray using a hoe. It's helpful to have an extra person around to help distribute the concrete while you're doing the mixing. Once the molds are about 3/4 of the way full, I'm going to add in the reinforcing mesh. I don't want to push it down too far, otherwise I'll get rust marks on the top of the countertops. So I'm just going to place it, add more concrete, and then as I vibrate the concrete with the hoe, the mesh will settle a little bit down. I use the hoe to push the concrete into all the corners of the molds, and screeded the top of the concrete using an extra piece of 2x4. I hot glued a piece of wood to the blade of my reciprocating saw and used that to vibrate out the air bubbles of the wet concrete. I don't want the concrete to dry out too fast, so I covered it with plastic drop cloths to keep some of the moisture in. We sprayed it with water every few hours for the first 24 hours to keep the concrete moist while it cures. After letting the concrete cure for 48 hours, I removed the screws, cut away the hot glue, and broke down the mold. The PVC pipe got stuck, so I drilled a few holes in the walls of the pipe and then used needle nose pliers to pull it out. While the countertops are curing, I started getting the base cabinets ready for placement. You can see how I made these cabinets in other videos in this series. The first piece of countertop isn't that big, so Ellie and I were able to lift it into place. The first piece of countertop went in great, so we started getting ready for the biggest piece, which is the middle section, which has the sink cutout. We lifted the middle piece of countertop into place to check to see that it fit right over the sink, and also to mark the location for the hole that we would need to drill for the faucet. I then drilled through the plywood and the 2x4 underneath it to make the hole for the faucet. We then removed the middle piece of concrete, peeled off the wrapper off the sink, and then laid down a bead of silicone caulk that would seal the sink right to the countertop. These pieces of countertop are really heavy, so I'm not even going to try to glue them down or anything. I'm just going to let their weight hold them in place. Because I cast them face down on melamine, the countertops came out pretty smooth. but I still sanded them a little bit with 400 grit sandpaper. Now that the countertops were installed, I was able to install the faucet. Now I am not a trained plumber, so I didn't want to do a full installation. I just did a dry fit, and then I had the plumber come later and connect it to the water. In preparation for sealing the countertops, we vacuumed them off and removed all the dust. For this particular sealant, it required the concrete to be damp. So I probably should have done this before I installed the countertops to save a little bit of mess, but I didn't, so I had to build sort of a wall of rags to sort of keep the water from getting everywhere, and then pour a little bit of water on the concrete so it could really absorb and be ready for the penetrating sealer. You should always check the manufacturer's instructions for concrete sealants, but basically for this one I had to keep the concrete wet for a few minutes, and then I started with a 50-50 mix of water and the sealant, and then wash that over for a few layers, and then progressively use layers of more concentrated sealant to keep washing into the concrete so it penetrate and soak into it. I'll put links to the products I used on my website. Once the sealer had completely dried, I buffed in a coat of concrete countertop wax. Both the penetrating sealer and the wax help protect the concrete. But if you're someone that really freaks out over every little stain, then concrete countertops are probably not a great option for you. I use Fusion Pro grout to seal in between the two concrete slabs. It's stain resistant and really easy to use. Personally, I like materials that change over time with use, and don't mind a few stains here and there. Keep your eyes open for other videos in this series, where we will show you how to make the base cabinets, and the rest of the open shelving that we used in this kitchen. And check out Quikrete.com to learn more about the concrete products I use. Check out our website for more detailed information, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel.